a woman with no name, a king with absolute power, and a court that never forgives. This is not a story about love. It's a story about access and the price of being allowed inside. About a woman who learned to survive in a world that only respected bloodlines. About desire dressed as status, affection controlled by protocol, and a palace where silence was more dangerous than words. This is the story of a woman who was seen by the most powerful man in France and hated by everyone else. Jeanne was the illegitimate daughter of a monk and a cook. She faced a bleak future. According to the customs of the time, she was destined to live among commoners. However, her mother worked in the house of Monsieur Dumousseau, a kind and generous man who grew fond of the girl. He provided Jeanne with an education and supported her thirst for knowledge. To protect her from a difficult fate, Monsieur Dumousseau paid for her education in a convent. However, she did not stay there long, as she had a taste for free-spirited literature, which eventually led to her being expelled from the convent. By then, Jeanne had grown into a beautiful young woman. Madame Dumousseau feared that her husband might not be able to resist Jeanne, so she accused her of a fabricated theft and expelled her, along with her mother, from the house. As they left, Monsieur Dumousseau gave them some money to help them survive for a while. Mother and daughter headed to Paris, scraping by with odd jobs until Jeanne found work with Madame de la Garde. It was an easy job in a wealthy household, but Jeanne made a mistake by becoming involved with Madame's sons, which led to her being dismissed once again. After that, Jeanne abandoned attempts to change her fate and accepted it. Her charm and wit made her very popular. One day, she met Count Jean-Baptiste du Barry. They developed a close relationship, and du Barry invited her to live with him. Jeanne took care of his son Adolphe, coming to love the boy as her own. In the home of Count du Barry, Jeanne caught the attention of Duke Richelieu. Growing close to her, he suggested to the Count that she be introduced to King Louis XV. The king had met many women, but had not taken a liking to any of them, so Richelieu decided to arrange a chance meeting between Jeanne and Louis, believing this would make their acquaintance feel more natural. Although Count du Barry cared for Jeanne, he was sometimes harsh with her. To him, she remained just a common girl, unworthy of delicate treatment. Duke Richelieu, too, did not miss an opportunity to belittle her. Finally, the meeting with the king took place, and Louis was momentarily stunned upon seeing Jeanne. Soon after, the king's valet, Jean-Benjamin de la Borde, arrived at the count's home with an invitation for Jeanne to the royal chambers. Upon arriving at the palace, she underwent a thorough examination before being allowed to meet the ruler. De la Borde gave her a brief lesson in etiquette, but once in Louis's chambers, she became flustered and made many mistakes. However, this allowed the king to see her as a real person rather than just a pretty doll. After spending the night with the king, Jeanne was granted the honor of witnessing his morning rituals. De la Borde led her to a room where she discreetly observed the king washing, dressing, and shaving in the presence of his family. After this, Louis gifted Jeanne a necklace and invited her to stay. Soon, the royal family went hunting, and Jeanne accompanied them, but remained in a carriage with de la Borde. As long as the king's wife was alive, Jeanne could not openly be shown as his mistress. Louis's daughters and his son, the future king of France, were also present at the hunt. Shortly after, Louis XV's wife passed away. During the mourning period, Jeanne was sent away from the palace, but the king later brought her back to spend time with her. When his daughters learned of this, they confronted their father to voice their disapproval. The situation worsened when the palace discovered Jeanne's origins. A commoner could not remain in the king's presence. To resolve this issue, Louis ordered her marriage to Count du Barry, who was handsomely rewarded for it. Thus, Jeanne acquired a title and a legitimate reason to be close to the king. After the wedding, she underwent another short course in etiquette with de la Borde, who tried to explain to her that from now on, she would be judged very strictly. However, Jeanne disregarded formalities and made several blunders during her first public appearance with Louis. First, she kept everyone waiting, and then she received loud applause. The king gifted her a young boy who recited a poem for her. The boy greatly charmed the Countess du Barry, and she took him in to provide him with a proper upbringing and education, hoping that Zamor would someday rise to prominence. Jeanne's behavior and antics sparked general outrage. Using her position, she imposed her passion for simplicity upon Versailles. Despite disapproving glances, young women began copying her style of dress. Jeanne was happy by the king's side, but the du Barry family worried about her future. They knew that sooner or later, Louis's interest in his favorite would fade, leaving her with nothing. They hinted that she should ask for property as a gift. The king understood this himself, so he gifted her an estate where they could retreat and spend time away from prying eyes. Despite Jeanne's successes, Louis's daughters viewed her poorly and seized every opportunity to ridicule her. The only one who supported the countess was Louise, the king's favorite daughter. However, Louise soon grew tired of the scandalous life at Versailles and left the court to become a nun. This saddened Louis deeply. He withdrew from everyone, even Jeanne, and took on a new mistress, although she didn't last long. Gradually, the king rediscovered his love for life and grew close to Jeanne again. They spent 4 happy years together. During this time, Adolphe and Zamore grew up into men, but this idyll was destined to end. The Dauphine Marie Antoinette arrived at court and was immediately set against Jeanne. She was led to believe that she could dispose of the king's favorite with a simple gesture, by simply ignoring the Countess du Barry. If Jeanne spoke to the Dauphine first, she would breach etiquette. If Marie Antoinette ignored her, all of Paris would turn its back on Jeanne. The Dauphine and the king's daughters began putting this plan into action. At a reception, when Jeanne tried to find a seat, she was denied a place on the bench. The only person who offered her a seat was the Dauphin, who showed his future wife how to treat Jeanne. But that same day, Jeanne received sad news. Adolphe had been mortally wounded in a duel. She rushed to bid him farewell, but arrived too late. He had died before she could see him. Jeanne was devastated by the loss of her beloved, though not biological son, yet she was not permitted to mourn openly. The king's daughters mocked her, while Marie Antoinette continued to ignore her. Louis arranged for the future wife of his successor to speak to Jeanne in public, which would restore the Countess du Barry's status in society. However, when the crucial moment came, Marie Antoinette demonstratively turned away from her and began playing with her dog. The king could not bear this humiliation. He visited the Dauphine and glared at her intensely. Sometime later, Marie Antoinette invited Louis to a play where she was to perform, but the king declined. The Dauphine realized her position might become unstable, and the alliance between France and Austria could be at risk. So, during the next meeting with Jeanne, she exchanged a few words with her. Overjoyed, the countess ran to the king to share the news, bursting into a council meeting, amusing all present, and kissed Louis. After this incident, the royal family was forced to accept du Barry, and a complete harmony returned to Jeanne and Louis's life. But their happiness was short-lived. The king fell ill with smallpox. He had to leave Versailles, and Jeanne went with him. Zamore stayed by her side throughout, while Louis was accompanied everywhere by de la Borde. The doctors struggled to determine what ailed the king. Once it became clear that Louis had smallpox, everyone knew he would soon die. De la Borde advised Jeanne to pack her things and leave her beloved, as after his death she would be mercilessly hunted. However, the countess refused to go. The young Dauphin and his wife also came to see the king, but they were not allowed into his chambers to avoid the risk of infection. One day, Louis touched his face and realized he was afflicted with smallpox. He asked for a mirror, and upon confirming his fatal illness, he wished to confess. A clergyman urged the king to renounce Jeanne as a demonstration of his repentance and readiness to enter the kingdom of heaven. Fearing damnation, Louis asked Jeanne to leave him. On the balcony, a candle was lit to symbolize the king's health. Louis received absolution, and Jeanne began to gather her belongings. When everything was ready, and she was already heading to the carriage to go to a convent, she suddenly stopped, turned around, and ran back to say goodbye to the king. At first, Jeanne was denied entry to Louis's chambers, but the Dauphin insisted she be allowed in. When Jeanne was finally by his side, she confessed her feelings to him, and as she left, she curtsied to the king for the first time. Before departing, she thanked the heir to the throne for his kindness and consideration. As Louis lay dying, de la Borde and Richelieu remained at his bedside. The king asked them to look after Jeanne after his death. As soon as the candle was extinguished, signaling Louis's passing, the crowd rushed to greet the new king. Jeanne du Barry lived in a convent for a year until she was granted a pardon by Louis XVI. However, she was forever banned from returning to Versailles. Jeanne left for her estate, where she lived until the French Revolution. During the upheaval, Zamor joined the revolutionaries and disavowed her. Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, were executed. Shortly after, Jeanne met the same fate. Before her death, she asked the executioner for a few more moments, as she had so loved life. For a moment, she had everything: the king's attention, a place at his side, a name spoken in rooms that once ignored her. But Versailles does not remember love. It remembers hierarchy. When the king is gone, so is her protection. No titles, no allies, no mercy, only the quiet truth. That proximity to power is never the same as belonging. In a world built on status, being chosen is not the same as being safe.